there's so many things. We may have to have several podcasts with Marvin as he's able to do that and available.
You are watching the Beyond Sunday podcast.
But we've talked lately, Marvin, about heaven. And you've thought a lot about heaven. And one of the things I love that Marvin says is, as you get older, the gravitational pull here on earth gets less and less, and the gravitational pull to be in heaven gets greater and greater. Another thing he says is, you start life very, very simple. You eat and you sleep, and also, Marvin doesn't say it this way, I'll say it this way, you eat, sleep, and you fill diapers, right? That's where you start. It's very simple. And then life gets very complicated, and then it gets simple again. So, Marvin, tell us a little bit about that, and as you've thought about heaven, you've formed some perspective.
Some thoughts.
That. Yeah.
Well, in a simple to complex to simple arena, I think that's what Jesus does. For me, the Bible is, don't mean this wrong, but the Bible is simple in its concept, but it's very complex, but it's also simple again.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in a way, it started out simple, and then you go through all the Old Testament up until the time of Jesus, and it gets very complex. And then Jesus comes along and says, unless you become as a little child, you can't enter the kingdom. What's he saying? He's saying, you got to get this simple again.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the most difficult things in life is to be able to take a subject and make it simple enough. Bill Bright used to call this the transferable concepts that he used. So he had the 4 spiritual laws, and they were transferable. And so there are concepts. And one of my children said to me one day, they said, Dad, you think differently than other people. If you get things into a concept.
Mm-hmm.
And so I began to do that with various things. And I found that to transfer something needs to be simple. And if you watch Jesus' teaching method, the Bible is a story. It is full of stories. But to my knowledge, Jesus is the only person in the Bible, with one exception, who taught by stories. Nathan used a story to teach King David. But other than that, I only find Jesus using stories. You memorize, you have to repeat over and over again to keep your memorization. Stories you remember. And Jesus taught in stories. He taught simply. I have a son who spent a great deal of time in the Holy Land, and I know, Dennis, you have gone with him, and a lot of people have. And but he has been so instrumental to me, I think, in helping me get things into a transferable
Mm-hmm.
form, into a conceptual form.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this whole arena, as I began to think about heaven and I began to think about the Bible, I think the Bible is really pretty concrete, simply in the sense that you have Genesis 1 to 3, and that's where you outline the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the Garden of Eden. And then you have the Garden of Gethsemane and the garden, the tomb. Well, that's a decision you make. Mm-hmm. Is God's will going to be done, or is your will going to be done? And then Revelation 21:22 is the garden in heaven.
Mm-hmm.
And the matter that you were mentioning that I'd been thinking about heaven is I have a concept that I call the Duality Dilemma. And that is that most of the things we'll deal with down here are choices we make. And when you look at the Garden of Eden, it's full of dualities. There is God and Satan. There's God and the sun and the moon. There is day and there's night. There's male and there's female. Mm-hmm. There's God's will and there's man's will. There's a whole concept, land and sea. And there's a whole
trees.
The tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Mm-hmm. And I looked through and I came up, I think, with about a dozen of what I call dualities. The duality dilemma is that God then handed to us the decision to make decisions. And he gave us free will. So there's God's will and man's will in heaven.
So well, when man life or death. Yeah.
And so man, as soon as he had that decision to make, he then chose. Well, he put us then down here, and everything is a choice. You know, whether we talk today or we don't, or whether you ask me this question or another question. Everything you're going to do, whether you're going to have a drink of water or a drink of pop. And so everything we do, we're faced with choices all day long. Mm-hmm. And Jesus, at the close of his Sermon on the Mount, says there are really three big choices. And he brings it down to simplicity again. Someone has said that the Sermon on the Mount is the language of the kingdom of God. And I believe that's true. And so if I'm about to lose my train of thought. I am 95, aren't I?
At least you have an excuse. That's why sometimes I want that excuse.
The deal of heaven. I mean, what is that? So I looked at the Garden of Gethsemane, and he made the decision on his will. But then I looked at the garden in the Garden of Heaven, and you know what the Garden of Heaven is? It's singular.
No more duality.
There's no dualities. There's day, but there is no night. Mm-hmm. There's light, but there is no darkness. Mm-hmm. There's God, but there is no Satan. There's land, but there is no sea. Mm-hmm. You go through the whole list, and you find out there's male and female up there. There's saints in the Garden of Eden. There's saints. There is no male or female. There's no marriage. There was marriage with God. He put the two of them together. It's not good for man to be alone. And when you get to the Garden in Revelation, it's the marriage is between Christ and the church. And so I said, what we've got here is over on this inside, we moved from duality to perfect unity. And so what we did is we did what Jesus prayed for in John 17. Mm-hmm. In John 17, verses 20 to 26, I believe it is, he said to them, he said to the Father, he said, I pray that they might be one, that they might be in me as I am in you, and that they might be in each other. And he bound us all up together. And he didn't make us all one mass. He made us instead what I say is an orchestra. In other words, perfect unity is an orchestra, and it's all in harmony. That's unity. It isn't enforced by a government edict. It is a voluntary acceptance of who God made me to be. And so I surrender my will. I let God's will be done. And if his will is done, then that means that we're going to play in tune. We're going to be in harmony. We're all going to be playing the right notes at the right time. Now, the kingdom of God down here, I believe that we enter the kingdom of heaven when I'm born again. And a man said to me, this is a whole other subject, we maybe want to talk about another time, but basically it means that down here, it'll be like we had a judge one time who said, do you want to know the difference between a trial court and an appellate court? Well, an appellate court, if you may or may not know, is one that's very quiet. It's in front of a panel of judges. There's no action. There's simply a podium. You go in front of that podium and you speak between you and the judges. And it's a very sedate kind of an activity. By contrast, the trial court, you've watched Perry Mason and all the rest of them from that point on, and you know the trial court can be, he said, would you like to know the difference between the trial court and the appellate court? He said, the appellate court is Handel's Messiah. The trial court is mud wrestling. Well, I think the kingdom of God, I believe the kingdom of God in heaven is Handel's Messiah. But I think living in the kingdom of God down here is mud wrestling.
That's a pretty good image, Marvin. Thus the reason the gravitational pull toward heaven gets greater and greater.
Yes. It does. So for me, I have found that the generations and the heaven and these various things, they kind of move together. And you will only see, it's like going up a mountain, folks. You'll only see what you can see.
The higher you get on the mountain.
The higher but you know what you can't see? Pretty soon you can't see back down below. So I can't see where you are at your age or my great-grandson at age 4. It's a long way down to try and see. And it's just as far for him looking up to see.
With that in mind, and this is also a big subject, and we'll kind of wrap up this segment with this thought. So you can speak into the generation below you. As we talk about this, sometimes 2 generations. What would you say to the generation below you as some ways they can prepare and understand moving from where they are, living where they are, and then preparing for the next?
Let me do it by a little concept, because that's been a big question for me and a lot of people. I call it age ghettos. We get into our age ghetto, and it's difficult to talk beyond it. But I have concluded that we should teach the younger people in order to help them have direction in life. That I should encourage the midlifers to help them have endurance in life. And that we should ask the elders to help them have purpose in life.
That's good. That's really good. We could talk a long time about that, but that's That's a lot to think about, Marvin. So we'll wrap up this segment with that thought, and we'll see you again next time.
This has been another episode of the Beyond Sunday podcast. And don't forget, like, share, and subscribe.